Plenty of things can go wrong in communication. We'll grab our Communication Square by Schulz von Thun and try to figure out some of them. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and today we will continue with the topic of communication. Last week I showed you the Communication Square by German psychologist Friedemann Schulz von Thun. Short reminder, Schulz von Thun states that a message, something someone says to someone else, has 4 different sides, 4 different aspects. There is factual information in it, there is self-revelation, there is relationship information, and there is an appeal. The sender, the person who is speaking, may put more or less emphasis on each of those 4 sides, and the receiver, the person who listens, may pay more or less attention to each of those sides. Today we will use the Communication Square to look at some problems in communication, and we will start with the self-revelation aspect. When we are little children, we quickly figure out that some parts of our personalities are not very desirable to adults, and we start hiding those parts of us. When we go to school, we enter a world of judges and competitors. We have teachers who judge our behavior and our abilities, and we have fellow students we compete against. This basically continues when we enter the working world, where we have superiors and co-workers. Now, this high amount of observation and judgment we have in our surroundings is difficult to deal with for a lot of people. Some of us can't really get out of it anymore. In entirely harmless situations, such as playing a board game with friends or being host to friends, or even having sex, they still feel like they have to perform and as they are being judged by their performance. Other people have a lot of problems in situations where they are indeed closely observed, such as when they are taking exams or when they are having a job interview. So, self-revelations is a difficult topic for a lot of us. We are afraid to reveal too much about ourselves, to show our feelings, to show our true selves to other people. So what we do is we put up a front. We hide our feelings. We try to be neutral and cool and rely on factual information, not show our feelings, not make clear statements. As a very simple example, let's say we are outside with a couple of friends and we are cold, and we could just say, I am cold. However, we might rather say something like, oh, it is cold here. We might catch a cold. One has to be careful. Aren't you cold? So we try to hide our own wishes and desires. Similarly, we try to show our good sides and make a good impression on people. Now, since heavy self-adulation isn't very popular, we try to stealthily slip into the conversation. What a great person we are. You know, recently my buddy Elon Musk told me that he doesn't think the IQ is very important, and I tend to agree because mine is 150 and I still make stupid mistakes every now and then. One habit that is luckily going extinct nowadays is to use very complicated language, use a lot of technical terms so other people know how well educated you are and how knowledgeable you are. A habit that is still popular nowadays is to steer the conversation towards topics you know a lot about, where you can impress people with your knowledge, to direct a conversation towards your home turf. Now pay some attention to that. Sometimes you might notice a kind of funny situation where in a conversation people struggle for this home turf advantage. So different people in the conversation each try to steer the conversation towards their favorite topic. If our conversations and our relationships are dominated by putting up fronts and trying to impress, we won't really get anywhere. Schulz von Thun provides a kind of funny example at one point where a husband says to his wife, "Would you like to go to a movie in the evening?" Now, the going to the cinema is probably the last thing he wants to do, but he thinks he should provide some entertainment to his wife. And the wife answers, "Oh yes, that would be great." She doesn't want to go either, but she doesn't want to disappoint her husband. So in the end, they go to the cinema even though no one actually wants to, which is not a great outcome, obviously. This whole putting up fronts and trying to impress each other behavior might even be harmful to our emotional well-being, because for us, as well as for other people, sometimes it's important to know that other people are uncertain too, and confused and hurt and have problems. So sometimes it is our weaknesses that make us human. As I mentioned last week, for Schulz von Thun, coherence is the ideal and the goal in communication. And coherence means to be true to ourselves and to be true to the situation. So being true to ourselves is what we should aim for regarding self-revelation. To sum it up, in regard to self-revelation, the important thing is to pay attention to how we put up fronts, how we try to impress each other, and try to be more true to ourselves. Next up, we have the factual information aspect. Here we have the problem that the factual information side is is frequently used as a kind of pretext for the actual issue. Schulz von Thun provides an example here of a mother who tells her daughter, "Oh, it's cold outside, you should put on your jacket." And the daughter replies, "No, it's not that cold, I don't need the jacket." Now, at first glance, mother and daughter can't agree on the outside temperature. However, it's more likely there is a relationship issue here, because the mother probably wants her authority to be respected, and she wants her daughter to do as she says. Maybe she wants to feel that she is needed and Maybe she thinks the daughter can take care of her own, and the daughter probably wants to defend her independence, and she might not object to the facts. She might not object to the fact that it's cold outside and it would probably be a good idea to wear a jacket. However, she objects to the notion that she can take care of herself and that she should do as her mother tells her. Now, it isn't much better for adults. What we as adults tend to do is to insist on the factual information side. We say, oh, this is a discussion about facts, and if some relationship issue comes up, we say, oh, this doesn't belong here. Now, what Schulz von Thun recommends is that interferences should take precedence because they naturally have precedence. If two people who have an issue with each other on the relationship side try to have a conversation about facts, about factual topics, the relationship issue will still show permanently until it is resolved. It's important to note that the factual information side is not in some way detached from the other sides, the other aspects. They are all part of an organic whole, of communication as a whole. And in our relationships, having mutual topics to discuss, mutual topics we care about, is a very important connecting element. One last rather pragmatic thing we should consider when dealing with the factual information side is that when we present information to other people, especially information on complex topics, complicated facts, that we should try to be clear and comprehensible. So, to sum it up, the factual information side is an organic part of the conversation as a whole, and we should neither try to emphasize it too much, nor should we use it as a pretext for the actual issues. And when we present complicated information, we should try to be as clear and as comprehensible as we can. Next up is the relationship side. As I mentioned last week, the relationship aspect actually contains two kinds of information. First, there is the information on how I see you, what impression I have of you. Then there is how I see us, what understanding I have of the relationship between us. Let's look at the impression I have of you first. We tend to quickly form an opinion of other people. However, our impression of other people is rarely accurate. This becomes quite clear if we consider that in our everyday life we take on several different roles. For example, you only experience me in my role as a YouTuber. You never experience me in my role as a spouse or an employee or a son or a brother or a customer or a course participant or something else. Usually, we even the people that are closest to us, we rarely experience in all of their different roles. For example, there are probably a lot of us who never experienced their own parents extensively in their roles as employees or as entrepreneurs or whatever. So There is a lot about other people we don't know. And those things we don't know, we either ignore them, so we act, for example, as if our superior doesn't exist outside of work, or we fill the gaps with our own interpretations. And there is another issue there, because we like to transfer our knowledge from our existing relationships to our new acquaintances. Let's say you have a troublesome relationship to your father and you meet someone who reminds you of your father. You will probably have a bad impression or a bad attitude towards this person at first, because you transfer the negative feelings you might have towards your dad to this new person you don't even really know yet. We sometimes even project our own undesired sides and undesired parts of our character onto other people we meet. Some conflicts just happen because we antagonize in other people what we don't like in ourselves. Let's move on to the relationship part. In our communication, in our conversations, it becomes quite clear what kind of relationship we have to the other person. Whether we are on the same level or one of us is above the other in some way. And it also becomes clear whether we like each other and enjoy talking to each other, or whether we just interact with each other out of necessity. However, our relationships don't just show in our communication. They are also constantly renegotiated. Let's say there is a new coworker at work and you have just met briefly and you don't know much about him yet. And Monday morning you meet him somewhere and he says, "Oh, hi, Mr., Mrs., whatever. How was your weekend?" By saying this to you, he proposes to you, he offers to you a change of the definition of your relationship, in the way that before you just talked about work topics and now you will also talk about private topics, personal topics. Now, there are different ways you can react to this offer. First of all, you can accept it by telling him about your weekend and asking him about his weekend. If you don't want to accept his offer, but you don't want to strongly object to it, you might just let it slip by saying something like, "Oh, it was nothing special," and then moving on to work topics. If you want to reject his offer, you might say something like, this doesn't belong here, or "I don't want to talk about my private life." And lastly, you could also just ignore his offer by moving on to some other topic. However, this would be a rather negative reaction, because by ignoring his offer, you also devalue it. A rather unpleasant issue regarding the relationship aspect is that the relationship side may be functionalized. Let's say in some company, management figured out that people are more motivated and work better if they feel they are valued and respected. Now, this usually won't result in a re-evaluation of the company culture. More likely, all the executives will just be sent into some human relation training where they learn to fake respectful behavior so they can maximize the motivation and performance of their employees. This is a topic of its own, and we will probably talk about it more extensively in the future. So, to sum it up, our relationships come alive and develop in our communication. And what we should keep in mind here is not to judge people too quickly because we know less about them than we might think. Also, we should stay away from functionalizing the relationship aspect because that takes us away from healthy communication. Now, this functionalization of the relationship aspect issue is a nice transition to our next and final topic, the appeal aspect. This functionalization of the relationship aspect shows a very basic issue of communication. Communication also means that I express myself, but it also means that I try to have an effect. And it is often not clear which of those I emphasize. Of course, my desire for an effect most clearly shows in the appeal that is contained in the message. There is always an appeal in our communication. However, it is often ineffective. This might occur for different reasons. First of all, an appeal is not a viable means for fundamental change. For example, if I tell someone, "Oh, don't be so hot-tempered," this probably won't cause a fundamental change of his personality. Furthermore, people might reject not the appeal itself, but the relationship aspect that comes with it, as in the example with the mother and the daughter who doesn't want to wear her jacket. She would probably agree to the appeal to wear the jacket because it's cold outside. However, she would at the same time agree to the relationship aspect, which is something like, as a mother, I have authority here, and this she doesn't want to do, so she rejects the appeal and the whole message altogether. Next, a problem that might occur in similar situations is that the appeal takes away creatorship from the receiver. Schulz von Thun provides an example here of a son who had planned to mow the lawn in the garden while his father is away as a nice surprise for his father. However, when the father is about to leave, he says, "Oh, if you get bored, you might mow the lawn," and this ruins it for the son. It makes a big difference whether we do something out of our own initiative or merely because we adhere to an appeal. There are also appeals that are impossible to adhere to because they deal with behavior that is naturally spontaneous and based on free will, or it deals with feelings. For example, you can't tell someone to be spontaneous, or at least he can't adhere to that. And you can't tell someone to be more independent. And in the same way, you can tell someone to wash the dishes, but you can't make him enjoy it. And it doesn't make much sense to tell someone who is in a bad mood or who is depressed to cheer up. Lastly, we will probably reject any appeal that threatens our peace of mind. Schulz von Thun gives a couple of examples here. Among those is a guy who is a heavy smoker and hears about the health risks from his physician, and a guy who was beating his children when they were small, and who hears from a psychologist about the psychological damage he probably caused. In those cases, the message contradicts the beliefs and behaviors of those people, and the appeal is either very, very difficult to adhere to, quit smoking, or it is too late for that, don't beat your kids. So those people will probably reject the appeal and the whole message by saying, oh, this is mere theory, you can prove anything using statistics, I don't believe in it, I've done nothing wrong, it probably won't be me who gets sick, or something like that. A very interesting topic regarding appeals is whether we are dealing with an open appeal or a hidden, a covered appeal. We tend to use covered appeals a lot. There are some possible reasons for that. First, we avoid self-revelation if we use a covered appeal because we don't have to reveal our wishes and desires. Furthermore, we also don't need to take responsibility. If the receiver asks, oh, you want me to do this and that, we can deny it. We can say, oh no, that's not what I meant. Furthermore, we might use a covered appeal because we are afraid of rejection, or maybe we don't know whether our wishes are reasonable, or we are afraid the receiver might say yes out of courtesy without really wanting to. Or some of us maybe were taught in their childhood that they shouldn't be too, that they shouldn't force their wishes and desires upon people. Maybe sometimes we want to enable the receiver to do something voluntarily rather than by adhering to an open appeal. And in relationships, love relationships, there might be a romantic idea that wishes should be obvious to our spouse or to our friend without the need for them to be stated openly. Nonetheless, Schulz von Thun clearly recommends to use the open appeal, to openly state our wishes and desires. Now, what is important here is that we use an open appeal as a means of information, that we don't say, this is what I want, now go do it, but that we say, all right, those are my wishes. What are your wishes? Let's see if we can come to an agreement. So, to sum it up, our communication always contains appeals, some of which are probably not adhered to, and the important thing for us is to try to use the open appeal more often and to stop using the covered appeal too frequently. Now, as I mentioned before, unfortunately, Schulz von Thun's books have not been translated into English, so I can direct you to the book for further information. However, I will provide further videos about theories and models and tools by Schulz von Thun. Please let me know in the comments how you like the topic so far and if there is anything you would specifically like to see. I would also be glad to get a like from you, and if you don't want to miss any future videos, please subscribe to the channel. We will see each other next week. There will be another book review, and this time I will talk about the Why Cafe, or the Why Are You Here Cafe by John Strzelecki. Until then, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.